Welcome to the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Mckern. Venture with me back to the cities of the dead as we go to uptown New Orleans, across the street from my old job, Commander's Palace, for which I was a shift cook, and could see this beautiful cemetery from the kitchen. For our many meetings in the courtyard of Commander's Palace, I would gaze over at Lafayette Cemetery number 1. Its pale walls are so inviting. And I invite you to join me tonight as we discover the history and haunted lore of one of the most famous cemeteries in New Orleans, Lafayette Cemetery number 1. Sit back and dwell in the darkness, my friends, and thank you for joining me in the Wicked Webs We Weave. The history of Lafayette Cemetery. A non-denominational, non-segregated cemetery, and the oldest of the 7 municipal, city-operated cemeteries in New Orleans. Lafayette number 1 was named for the city of Lafayette and established in 1833. It was the first cemetery in the city where non-Catholics could be buried and contains over 26 nationalities. Lafayette number 1 was designed by Benjamin Boyson, city surveyor, and acquired from Cornelius Hearst, holder of the Levitas plantation. The plantation was subdivided into city squares in 1832 and sold to the city, following its annexation by New Orleans in 1852. The city of Lafayette in Jefferson Parish no longer exists, and is simply known today as the Garden District. Lafayette was a city of transplants, composed mainly of German and Irish-born citizens and their children. The Garden District and its grand mansions were later established by the New Orleans American elites in the late 1840s, who wanted to separate themselves from the Creoles and the hustle and bustle of the French Quarter. The formal, 4-quadrant grounds of Lafayette number 1 take up an entire city block and house around 1,100 family tombs and more than 7,000 people. In its heyday, there was an abundance of fragrant and beautiful flowers adorning its narrow alleyways, and with its cross-shaped pattern, gave a park-like atmosphere that was especially enjoyed on All Saints' Day. Within decades of its opening, thanks to the likes of yellow fever, this beautiful Southern Gothic cemetery was filled to capacity with coping tombs, interment chambers, mausoleums, crypts, and society tombs. It is currently maintained by Save Our Cemeteries Incorporated, and was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972. Death by yellow fever took the lives of thousands of New Orleanians and aided in the mass occupancy of Lafayette number 1. Reading many of the inscriptions on the tombs of the departed, you will see, died of yellow fever, more times than you can count. The residents of the Garden District spaced their gardens and homes far apart. Think that this would protect them from the saffron scourge. What had happened instead was a virtual breeding ground for mosquitoes, created by their reflecting pools, bird baths, cisterns filled with standing water. After decades of complete devastation to the population, the residents' efforts to thwart this horrible disease proved futile when it was discovered that yellow fever was spread by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Between the years of 1817 and 1905, when the last epidemic hit the nation, more than 40,000 people died in the Crescent City. In 1853 alone, nearly 9,000 of the city's 154,000 inhabitants perished, after almost 30,000 contracted the disease. There was anywhere between 150 to 250 funerals per day that year, a great number of them in Lafayette number 1. A 3 to 4 foot underground coping was made of stone or brick was built where the pine box was placed in Victorian times. It was popular to be buried with the soil of your home state or country. This is the way it was done in the Lafayette Cemetery number 1, and the dirt was shipped in and used to cover the caskets. Wall vaults and interment chambers. Wall vaults or interment chambers serve as the walls of Lafayette Cemetery number 1. They provide a less prohibitive alternative to building a private family tomb. We like to call them the apartments, as opposed to private estates. There are approximately 500 wall vaults in Lafayette number 1. Cemeteries in New Orleans also use these wall vaults. You can see them throughout the city. A closure tablet is a stone slab on the front of an above-ground crypt that is engraved with the names of the deceased. When a tablet is filled or replaced, or the family sells their crypt, the slab is put on the side of the tomb to make room for the new stone. The Smith Doomstree tomb in Lafayette No. 1 has 37 names inscribed on its closure tablet, and it's supposedly awaiting 10 more. Society tombs became common with immigrant ethnicities such as German, Irish, Italian, and Hebrew. Check out the German Presbyterian community tomb in Lafayette No. 1. Later, benevolent associations, fraternal groups, charities, military, police, firemen used this highly efficient form of interment as a way to make the aftermath of death less taxing. People often did not have the money for their own family tombs, so this is a way of having burial insurance. Below are some of the society tombs located in Lafayette No. 1. The Independent Order of Odd Fellows. The Independent Order of Odd Fellows, IOOF, purpose is visit the sick, relieve the distressed, bury the dead, and educate the orphan. They have a society tomb here in Lafayette No. 1 that were allowed to be buried after paying membership dues. The New Orleans Home for the Incurables. The New Orleans Home for the Incurables was a place of refuge for the disabled and gravely ill. They were generally left and forgotten about by their own families. A society tomb was created to offer them a final, peaceful resting place. The Society for the Relief of Destitute Orphan Boys, now known as the Waldo Burton Memorial Home, was a much-needed charity in the time of yellow fever. It provided resources and housing for orphan boys, and the societal tomb as their final resting place. The Jefferson Fire Company Tomb is the largest of 3 volunteer firefighter companies' societal tombs in Lafayette No. 1. Famous tombs at Lafayette Cemetery, the Woodmen of the World. This fraternal monument, Woodmen of the World, which you will see throughout Lafayette No. 1, has 4 objects carved into it: a maul, an axe, a wedge, and a dove. The organization was known to have done volunteer work in the local communities. The Miniature Graveyard. The McClellan Fayosseau tomb has a broken column as its centerpiece, which makes it hard to miss. The son of the family who was killed in action in the Civil War is memorialized with this monument. It is said that the family wanted to be buried in the soil of their home state, which was brought to create the raised family graveyard you see today. Famous burials in Lafayette Cemetery. There are many famous and infamous inhabitants of Lafayette No. 1 Cemetery in the Garden District. Here are just a few. Brigadier General Harry T. Hayes, born April 14, 1820, deceased August 21, 1876. Hayes was a distinguished Confederate general who led the 1st Louisiana Brigade in the Civil War, playing a major role in the Battle of Gettysburg. Judge John Howard Ferguson, born June 10, 1838, passed November 12, 1915. Judge Ferguson was known for the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal case that took place in 1896 in New Orleans, during the Reconstruction era of the South after the Civil War. The Brunies family of musicians. The Brunies were a musically talented, famous for their associations with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, Papa Lane, the Halfway House Club of New Orleans, Louis Prima, and the Dixieland Revival. Merritt, George, and Albert are all interred here in Lafayette No. 1, among their other family members. The Karsten Dick family tomb, better known as Lestat's tomb, thanks to author Anne Rice. This cast-iron structure is only 16 of its kind in New Orleans, being one of its kind, and the only one in Lafayette No. 1. The Wood and Miltonberger Company that made these customized tombs also manufactured the cornstalk fences you see around the French Quarter and Garden District today. Film and TV in Lafayette Cemetery. As the most filmed cemetery in New Orleans, Lafayette No. 1 is host to many movie and TV scenes. author inspirations, and even music videos. The likes of Mark Ruffalo, Ryan Reynolds, and Samuel Jackson have been spotted inside. It also has been rumored that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant used to frequent the tree-lined pathways. The movies Double Jeopardy in 1999, Dracula 2000, had scenes set on these hallowed grounds. The CW Networks, The Originals, and NCIS New Orleans, along with music videos by LeAnn Rimes and New Kids on the Block, have been filmed here as well. It is no secret that Anne Rice was heavily influenced by Lafayette No. 1, having lived only a few blocks away. The Mayfair Witches of the Witching Hour and Interview with the Vampire's Crypts were modeled from the Jefferson's Fireman's Tomb and the Karstendijk family tomb, respectively. She also staged her own jazz funeral to promote her book, Memnoch of the Devil. Lafayette No. 1 Cemetery is located at 1416, 1498 Washington Avenue, New Orleans, Louisiana, 70131. Open 7 days a week from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., closed most holidays. It is free entry to open the public. Please check in advance before arriving, as COVID has changed these hours and also visitation. The Ghosts of Lafayette Cemetery No. 1. Officially sanctioned as a cemetery in 1833, the Lafayette Cemetery was one of the first official Protestant cemeteries in a predominantly Catholic city. Before this and the founding of the Garrard Street Cemetery in 1826, Protestants were buried below ground at the back of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. As the city's Protestant population grew due to the Louisiana Purchase, the city and that small, squalid patch of land at the back of the old cemetery became overcrowded. The Garden District was soon formed as part of his boom, formerly the Lafayette Plantation. It was developed by French architect and planner Barthélemy Lafon, along with much of the upper river side of the city. In 1833, it became the city of Lafayette. Named after the French war hero and city, was a mecca for American Protestant culture. The wealthiest of Americans lived in the Garden District, and their extravagant spending left us with homes that can run up to $5 million or more. Take a tour of the Garden District to see these beautiful homes. Having worked in the Garden District myself, I took all my lunch breaks walking around, seeing Anne Rice's home and the many mansions, and it is quite beautiful. Despite their wealth, death, as always, acted as the great equalizer. Americans upriver were not spared the horrors of yellow fever that their Creole counterparts downriver experienced. At first, below-ground burials were preferred, sticking with the Protestant customs, but due to the city's high water table and marriages between Creoles and Americans, above-ground tombs soon became standard in Protestant cemeteries as well. Always the industrious types, the Americans invented a new kind of tomb. These graves, called coping tombs, allowed soil burial without the hazard of the casket or bodies floating away. They are large open chambers framed with brick, stone, and plaster, with walls reaching up 3 feet above the ground. Chambers then filled with sediment, and caskets are lowered into the ground. One such coping tomb holds 48 caskets inside. Up to 7,000 people are interred in Lafayette Cemetery No. 1, and it's known that many of these eternal residents of the area never fully rested. The ghost of Commander's Palace, being located across the street from a cemetery with over 7,000 people, is bound to attract a spirit or two. Opened in 1893, Commander's Palace has become a staple in New Orleans culinary culture. Bought by the prominent Brennan family in 1973, the same who painted its famous Commander's Palace blue, the restaurant has been commanded by a slew of reputable chefs. They say some even remain behind in the afterlife to look after it. Most famously, Emeril Lagasse was a head chef here from 1983 to 1990. Before him, it was Paul Prudhomme, the man who brought Creole and Cajun cooking to the American public. Emile Commander was the first head chef from whom the restaurant gets its namesake. He brought the restaurant to international popularity by 1900 He died of tuberculosis in 1906 while traveling in England. But ever the perfectionist, it is said that he returned to the restaurant to make sure operations were running smoothly. Many have seen him, mustachioed and properly dressed, as was fashionable then, meandering between tables to ensure that the service and food are top-notch. Perhaps he is proud of his restaurant's accomplishments and has chosen to stay for all eternity. Many have also seen the spirit of a young girl in a white dress haunting the staircase and top floor of the building. It was common for children to contract yellow fever, a disease with high mortality that ran amok in New Orleans, spread by mosquitoes, natural inhabitants of the swampland. It killed over 41,000 people between 1817 and 1905. These were the only years kept on record, and many more were killed beforehand. 1853, the deadliest year of the Saffron Scourge. Nearly 8,000 people died in New Orleans at its hands. In Lafayette Cemetery No. 1, there is a tomb that indicates 3 children died in 1878 at a very young age due to yellow fever. Perhaps this is what did this poor girl. Some have even seen the spirit of this young girl running around the cemetery. The influence of Lafayette Cemetery extends far past its limits between Washington and Britannia Street. It has been recreated in the popular video game Red Dead Redemption 2 and has been seen in many films. People come from all over to witness its majestic walls, hoping to recreate the magic they saw in their favorite movie or television show. Special thanks to Deader Beater B. The Cemeteries of New Orleans, A Cultural History, 1st edition. Louisiana State University Press, 2017. Florence Robert, New Orleans Cemeteries, Life in the Cities of the Dead, 1st edition, Batur Press, 1997. I would also like to thank GhostCityTours.com and USGhostAdventures.com in research for making this episode. Please also see the description. I have linked videos showing the tour of Lafayette Cemetery No. 1 and where you can find these original videos and support the creators. Thank you again for joining me on my cemetery strolls in the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. I am your host, Ryan Mckern. Warm yourself by the proverbial fire, and until we meet again, au revoir.